today's topic is environmental history, which is an interesting thing for me. It's a novel idea to me. Back in grade 7, history consisted of a long string of dates of when this army beat that army, when this king came over, and on you go. That was history back in grade 7 for me. But that was back in the middle of, well, late in the last millennium, I'll say it that way. Things have changed since then. And so looking at the environmental consequences of events in history, especially when applied to North America, South America, Central America, hasn't been heavily pursued, let's say. So we have 3 people here today who have some expertise on the subject. I'll introduce you to them, and then we'll get started. Scott Cave, who somehow got a matching shirt for Keith, but anyway, independent researcher with a PhD in history from Penn State, and he works on colonial Latin America. And his recent book, an article rather, Madalena, The Entangled History of One Indigenous Floridian Woman in the Atlantic World, was a winner of a prize, the Tivisar Prize, and published in the journal The Americas. Keith Plymers, who's an assistant professor in the Mideast, that is to say, Illinois, from Laramie, that's the Mideast. The Far East would be like Maryland and Virginia and places like that. He's an assistant professor of history at Illinois State University, and he has a book titled No Wood, No Kingdom, Political Ecology in the English Atlantic, and it's coming out next month. So it's soon to be, and you can pre-order it now if you jump onto Amazon. And Melissa Morris, our very own Melissa Morris, from the University of Wyoming, assistant professor of history, and her research focuses on also environmental and agricultural knowledge in the colonial Americas. And she's working on a book about tobacco cultivation in the 17th century. So environmental history as it applies to North America, Central America, the Americas, I guess I can say. Why don't we start with, I'll just, in the order that you're appearing in my little Hollywood squares, it'll be Melissa, Keith, Scott at this moment. Just a brief introductory comments to make, remarks to make, and then we'll see where we go with questions and comments from the audience. Melissa.
Yeah, thanks, Ken, for the introduction. And this is cool for me because I've hosted a few of these, but now I have turned the tables a bit, and I'm on the panel. So in terms of my work and how it fits into this subfield of environmental history and environmental history of the colonial Americas, I describe myself as a historian of the colonial Americas, by which I mean, not just parts of North America as we here in the US often take it to mean, but also the Caribbean and even bits of South America. I work especially on the early 17th century, especially on the English, the Dutch, a bit on the French, and their interactions with indigenous people and with the Spanish colonists who had been there for a while by the time they show up. So the project I'm working on right now is about tobacco cultivation, which I argue is crucial to these non-Iberians, so non-Spanish, non-Portuguese people who are trying to colonize. So one question that I'm really interested in that guides a lot of my research is about the role of the environment in either creating or foreclosing possibilities. So to just give like a few fun examples. Colonizers often show up in places with ideas about what they could grow there or what they might find there. And they did this quite often with a pretty flawed understanding of the environment, which was not entirely their fault. It had to do with the fact that people hadn't totally worked out how climate worked in this era. So for example, the English want to grow sugar in Virginia, and the Dutch want to turn New Netherland, with today's New York, into a tobacco colony. So geography and the environment also, they play a lot into relationships between colonizers and indigenous people. So another place I study and border a little bit obsessed with, the Guianas, which are in South America. The interior is very hostile, like really inaccessible to people who don't understand the environment. So Europeans are very reliant upon indigenous people for so much. Like anytime they want to get anywhere or do anything, they need indigenous allies. And then they also, because of that, develop these really wild ideas about what's in the interior, you know, like El Dorado, headless people, giant women. And that sounds kind of silly, but it's actually winds up being consequential to later events, and it motivates their actions. So to me, thinking about the environment is a way to better understand relationships among these different groups in these early encounters. And I think that's an important, because I think a lot of times people think environmental history and they think, you know, it's about, you know, plants and trees and not about people, which, you know, it can be, but for me, ultimately, it's about, it provides a better understanding for relationships among people, which are, to me, at the heart of what is interesting about history. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Melissa. Keith?
Yeah, thanks so much. I always love hearing every time you describe your work, Melissa. It's such a pleasure to hear it, because it's just such a cool project, and I can never wait to read more of it. So I usually describe myself as an early modern environmental historian, and my PhD training was in early modern Europe, Britain and Ireland, and the Atlantic world. So I'm a bit of a field straddler in that way, and that's been really helpful for me. And as I've done more environmental history, both in grad school and then afterwards, teaching things like that, I've ended up thinking and talking with people who are writing about the future, who are writing about the 20th century, the 19th century, things like that. That's one of the, I think, the best parts about doing environmental history. You're in these really broad conversations. You have to know a little bit about the American West and a little bit about a ton of different topics to do this. In my book, I take on a question of what is scarcity, and take on this idea of resource scarcity in the early modern period. And there's this idea, it's a pretty popular one, that Europeans burnt through all of the trees in Europe, and as a result, they needed to go elsewhere and secure supplies that would enable them to keep Europe functioning. And there's been a number of historians who've pointed out, well, there are these preservation measures happening at the same time. Carl Poon is really foundational for that. But John Wing has done cool stuff with that for early modern Spain as well. And I thought, okay, I want to try to understand within England's emergent empire, are they experiencing a wood scarcity? And then how does that shape colonial expansion or not? So in my book, I take some time looking at how English people understood scarcity and the really complicated politics of that in England. And the argument I make is that rather than a sort of absolute physical scarcity in any place other than London, the key issues are over how woods are going to be put to use and who's going to get to use them. Should they be commons for the poor? Should they be open to people who are engaging in manufacturing activities, ironwork, things like that? Should they be reserved for what we would call national security, for things like building ships for the Navy? Should they be controlled by the crown or locals? And that when you get to that, you wind up seeing that scarcity, rather than a sort of concrete push, is a bit of a mess, even in England. And that mess ends up really shaping a lot of what happens elsewhere. So I look in Ireland and at how Ireland is first proposed as a solution to scarcity and then winds up becoming a problem, and why that happens, the way that the project of plantations work there. I look at how Virginians attempt to get in on transatlantic timber trades. And like Melissa, I spend a lot of time thinking about how English people were trying to understand what they were encountering, and the ways in which they were often deeply disappointed with what they found. And then I turned to Bermuda and Barbados to try to think about how places outside of the sort of big commodity producers, but that nonetheless had significant woodland preservation, things like that in the 16th and 17th centuries in particular for those places, functioned and fit into both Atlantic and then Caribbean in the case of Bermuda or sorry, of Barbados into those worlds. And so for me, the core question of doing early modern environmental history, I really like to think about scarcity. I try to think about both trees and people, to go to Melissa's point earlier, and find that it's a lot of fun thinking about both. And I'll leave it there and turn it over to Scott.
Hey, so like Keith, I'm a bit of a rebel child. I was I was taught or prepared to work on the Aztec and Maya regions of Central America. And my dissertation ended up being on the southern United States and the Caribbean in the 16th century. And so in my dissertation, I look at a really basic question that I've always had, which is like, how did Indigenous people and Europeans communicate when they encountered one another? And so I'm just starting sort of my journey as an environmental historian in some ways, because one of the things I discovered through writing that dissertation is that Spanish people are evaluating the landscape, and they're using commodities as a way to communicate. They'll literally bring samples of wheat up the Colorado River and show them to the local people and be like, do you have this? There's a great, one of the initial contact narratives for the early modern world is from the Canary Islands. And some Italian guys kidnapped some Canary Islanders. This is in like 1347. And they feed them all these different Italian foods. And for the most part, they like them, but they think wine is just disgusting because they've never had, rotten grapes before. But anyway, I ended up having to talk about the environment and what Indigenous people and Europeans found important in the landscape in writing. And then right before I finished my dissertation, I found two Indigenous women from Appalachia, of all places, who were taken down to St. Augustine, Florida. And in 1600, just before the English are really trying to settle Virginia, the Spanish become interested in North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, the interior of the United States, especially Appalachia. And so these women give beautiful descriptions of what Appalachia was like when they were children in the 1560s. And so I have this beautiful, like almost year zero, 1492 kind of examination of what life was like in Appalachia. And like, they're too good a sources not to use and not to share with the larger early America field. So I'm playing with translating those sources, but also thinking about the depth of environmental change from 1565 to now, because I live about 20 miles from one of the women's hometowns and about 2 hours from another. So it's a territory that I know quite well. And I apologize for the camera going on and off. My son is going to be born in 4 days, and we're cramming till the last minute. So I realized there was a big pile of stuff just out of frame there. So
premature congratulations on, so to speak. When Keith, you mentioned the scarcity issue, and then I was reflecting on my experience with history back in grade 7, and it just crossed my mind that the Easter Islander, of course, is the poster child for what happens when you run out of ecological resources, right? In that case, it was wood. Had a big effect on that particular culture. When you do environmental history, I can sort of easily imagine going back into archives and seeing tax records and things like that to keep track of, civil exchange, if you will, civilian exchange. Where the heck do you look for sources for environmental history, for how people's actions were affecting the environment, only 300 or 400 years ago? How do you do that? Where do you look? I'll go around in the reverse order now, if you don't mind, Scott. That's going to put me right back to you first, if that's okay. If you'd rather catch your breath, you're muted right now.
I am indeed muted. Okay. Unlike the folks in the chat, I haven't been teaching on Zoom all year, so I'm still getting used to the technology. But like I said, I look for Indigenous testimonies about where they're from, because the Spanish like to kidnap people. In fact, my first article is the story of a woman who was kidnapped from Tampa, went to Havana, to Seville, to Havana, and back. And it turns out there's a lot of those stories if you go look in the archive. And often the Spanish will ask, well, like, we were where you were from for like a little while, but we don't remember it that well. Can you tell us what was there? And so there's a simultaneous process of them remembering, like, for example, the woman who lived about 20 miles away from here, she describes a bison herd in Southwest Virginia, which historically is attested to, but I cannot imagine to save my life. She describes mostly living on chestnuts, which the eastern chestnut is effectively extinct. She also describes pearls, like this dressing in pearls and giving themselves pearl nose studs and things like that. And the pearls come from river mussels that are almost totally wiped out now. But the other interesting thing about those kinds of testimonies is they're trying to get home. And so they're describing the ideal environment, both to Spaniards, like it's their home environment, so they're inclined to like it, but they're also trying to sell it in ways that appeal to the Spanish. So the woman from North Carolina is like, listen, Florida, too sandy, not enough food, too much fish. Where I'm from, we got deer. The pigs are going buck wild, the pigs you guys brought, which is a detail I find very strange, because they're not supposed to be there, but, and yeah, like I said, in other encounter narratives, they're using in aspects of the environment to like communicate what kind of resources they have and what they're interested in. And so, yeah, it's not a huge source base, but it's something that I'm interested in. In my first article, I didn't know much about the sort of economy or ecology of Tampa Bay, despite the fact that I'm from there. And so I had to look at archaeology for shell middens, because, a shell midden is just a list of what was for dinner 500 years ago. So it's mostly Indigenous testimony, but I also do try to rely on other sources as well.
So when you're reading accounts of what people had to tell each other at those times, you're sort of reading between the lines, looking for elements in those stories that can inform you about environmental aspects of that time. Okay, that's cool. Keith, where do you turn to for sources?
Yeah, so one of the things I just wanted to flag up that is so cool about what Scott pointed out. So there's a move now in parts of the southeastern U.S. to rethink grasslands as a critical part of the ecology there, and something that's been ignored by a lot of restoration efforts. And I think, a lot of people wonder, like, oh, what does history have to contribute to this conversation? The fact that Scott has testimony on bison herds in Virginia and the grasslands there that would have been needed to support them, I think is really important evidence that backs what a lot of ecologists have been trying to puzzle through for the region. So just those testimonies are so critical, far beyond the field of history that we might normally think of. In terms of my own work, one of the sources that I rely most heavily on for a couple of parts of the book is looking at deeds and leases. So in property records, you get a lot of discussion about what counts as a resource on a particular piece of land. And so in Barbados, I went through about 2,500 deeds from the first 30 years of the English colony there, and just looked for any mention of a tree that I could find. And they would come up with some frequency. And then I would look and say, okay, are there any preservation conditions attached to this? Or are there any rules for when you can cut it down? In Ireland, I went through the Earl of Cork's papers in a lot of detail, and he was the largest landowner in Ireland in the 17th century. He left a really complete set of records. So I went through every deed and lease I could to see, is he mentioning trees? What are the rules for trees? There's a shift that you can find when you go through the leases in serial form, where people were once allowed to cut trees for firewood, and then he moved them off of trees and said, no, now you've got to go cut turf, which, if you've ever been to Ireland, it is the most distinctive smell and smoke color in the world. It's beautiful. I love it. But you're cutting peat bog out and drying it and using it as bricks for fuel. He switches them over to turf at one point in the 17th century. So I'm really trying to think about management. One of the tricks with my source base, and this is where I think being an environmental historian is both fun and challenging, is that people were confused a lot, and people occasionally lied, or people had political interests that shaped the way they described the land around them. So in some cases, and I love to highlight this in the book, one person comes through and says, unfortunately, all the trees in the area are dead. And then another person comes through 6 months later and says, this is the greatest forest we've ever seen. It's full of enormous and profitable plants. And I really try to play with that confusion. Every now and again, I get lucky, and there are sources from either archaeologists, like what Scott worked with, or from dendrochronologists, people who are working on tree ring data, on bog pollen data in Ireland, where I can start to get a sense of, okay, is tree cover changing around this period? And then trying to put those archaeological, scientific, and sort of fine-grained historical sources in place. But I would say, for anyone who's interested in this, property records can be a really incredible way to understand how people are trying to explain what land is and what's valuable in it. And once you start hunting, you find a lot of weird little things that are quite telling, that you might not think would be there amidst the measures of acreage or things like that.
Right. Oh, thank you. So detective work is involved in environmental history. The sources you look at aren't direct and obvious. I wouldn't have thought of looking at deeds and stuff like that, but yeah, detective work, cool. Melissa?
I'm going to talk
sources.
a little bit about like less detective work, because one thing I find is that people talk about environment and the weather and what the place they're living is like all the time, right? These are like pre-modern people. Even if they are not themselves agriculturalists, they still are tied to the land and the environment in ways that we sometimes forget that we still are, but don't always remember that in our own society. So a lot of the sources I look at are people who are traveling to places that are new to them. So, travel accounts, or sometimes, like ship's logs, or, promotional material for colonies sometimes, or letters about, kind of related to all of these things. So people that are attempting to colonize these new places, and so they're assessing them for their possibilities, and possibility to them often is, what kinds of goods are growing here? What are they? A lot of times, again, like in my work, a lot of times it's people getting things wrong about the environment. So they're not always right. They're like, this is this kind of tree. It's the same kind of tree. You're like, that's not the same. Or, this is gold, not gold. So a lot of times it's not quite right. But often it is. And even when they're wrong, they often betray some kind of careful attention to the environment that does tell us other things. So another source for me is I use maps a lot. So like those hogs Scott is talking about, like they draw them into maps, right? Like, or, you know, plants and things. And again, sometimes a bit fantastical. So sometimes you have to tease out what they're actually experiencing and what they're hoping to see and find. But, you know, I mean, people talk about what the environment is like a lot in sources from this period, and well, many periods. But it's just something that they're you know, preoccupied with all the time. So yeah.
So there's an impact, direct impact between environmental history and current life, when people in different parts of North America, for example, are trying to take patches of landscape and restore it to its former self. What do you mean by that, right? I mean, I'm sure, Keith, that and Scott, that people doing that in the Carolinas, for example, it might not occur to them that no, all these chestnuts and the forestry, the oaks are not it. It was grassland before that. How do you set? It's a difficult question, I'm sure. What time epoch do you want to turn the landscape back to, and why? Restoring it to its former self. Of course, any landscape, when you think of it that way, then across the span of geological time, there's no such thing. They're always changing and responding. And anyway, that just struck me that. But if people are trying to restore, let's restore this, you know, patch of southeastern North Carolina to its former self. Well, Scott would say, what about just grassland? Because there were bison here then. It's not an obvious answer. There's no obvious answer to the question of what's the right time point. You could say, you know, there are some landmark time points like first contact, as you brought that up. But even before that, the people who formerly lived in vast numbers on this continent, they were constantly changing the landscape over eons also, as the climate changed and as their food sources, whatever, evolved over time. Are there other ways that occur to any of the three of you? And I'm going to maybe, should I keep on going back and forth? Is that fine? So, or should I just keep on going in circles? Do you have another? So I'll pose the question, and it's coming to you, Melissa, I guess. Everybody seems okay with whatever order, except I will not answer the question. Are there other ways in which environmental history, the work you do on environmental dimensions, I'll say, to historical events from 400 years ago, 300 years ago, how do they affect or impact other more, I'll say, well understood or well thought of first things that people think of when history, how does environmental history interrelate and affect some of that other strains or dimensions of historical work?
Yeah, and just to kind of return to what you were saying about, you know, when we're attempting to think about restoring landscapes, I mean, it's like a fascinating question that you're welcome to join my environmental history class next week. We're talking a little bit about this, you know, this question of like when how do you roll back the, you know, do you think about like, do you think about like a Virginia with bisons and pearls, and like I thought that whole that source is really moving and makes us think about you know, I think we have an idea of like what the land should look like, but there's, you know, landscapes are always changing, right? There isn't some kind of eternal like pristine version of that landscape, which isn't to say we shouldn't like make some effort to you know, roll back some maybe damage and changes we've made, but that there isn't some perfect answer to that. But to answer your other question, I think environmental history, I mean, I think for early America, like we were talking a little bit about this in the pre-show chatter, but there, you know, environmental history has tended to be a bit more modern. And I think that's partly because, you know, it comes a little bit about, it has like strong connections to environmentalism and the environmentalism movement. And so because of that, then there's more of a, I think an urge or a desire to see as modern history is like perhaps more pressing, more urgent in that story, which, you know, I think there's some truth to that, but I think you know, as as someone who works on the kind of early modern Americas, I think, you know, the colonization of the Americas is like the most important. Everything traces back to that. Not really, but I think that, you know, you look at the environmental consequences of that, and a lot of them are, you know, resonate today. So to me, I think that's the importance of thinking about this field in terms of, you know, how it impacts or influences other fields, other subfields of history. I think that there, you know, that if you look at it, like a lot of things are environmental in nature, right? Like there's an uprising of enslaved people, right? And like a lot of times there's a drought that happens, but you know what I mean? That there's like an environmental like consequence or dimension to almost every history. And it isn't to say that the environment is the only thing that matters, but just that there's a lot of that, and there's a lot of it's a backdrop to a lot of these things, I would say. And I also think, so it goes both ways. Like I think that environmental history of this period has a lot to say to environmental questions of the present day, as well as to other subfields of history. But I will pass the baton to Keith now.
Yeah, thanks. I wish I could take your class. It sounds great. Yeah, I agree a lot with what Melissa said about the origins of environmental history and the modern environmental movement, things like that. I think there's a nice crop of early modernists working at various points around the world who are starting to say this is a really important period. So maybe to touch a little bit on Michael's question in the chat as well. Hopefully this will do that. We've got this. Sorry, I've got a dog wandering into my house right now. We've got a period there that is experiencing climate change. So the Little Ice Age is happening in the 17th century. And sorry, I got a little buddy here. The Little Ice Age is happening right around the period that we refer to as the early modern period. And we see people attempt to adapt to a changing climate, and we see people attempt to adapt to events, storms, frosts, things like that that might seem unpredictable or strange to them. And so in some ways, that's so incredibly relevant to our present moment. I think the other way in which environmental history can speak to larger fields, one of the questions that I wanted to answer in taking on this project is, you know, why do Europeans leave Europe? And what shapes their attitudes when they get there? And in the course of doing that, you know, this is sort of a typical historian response. I ended up answering my question with more questions to some degree. Like, I'm not sure I know why they did it. They kept failing, and they didn't go home despite having an absolutely massive set of problems whenever they show up in these places. So I mean, I think environmental questions speak to a ton of things. Just one example from a modern one, there's a book by Paul Ward, Sverker Sorlin, and Libby Robin on the environment, sort of a history of the idea. They talk about these sets of plans made during Cold War war games in the United States that were focused on how to try to affect rainfall, snowfall, and other conditions in the Soviet Union. So even if you're thinking about something like what defines the Cold War, you can tell a story about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but you also need to think about these plans to harm Russia through altering rainfall patterns or weather or things like that. I mean, these are environmental histories are at the core of so many other histories too, once you start to scratch the surface. And now I'm going to turn it over to Scott. Thank you for indulging me as my little buddy came to say hi.
We are at some risk of me having the same thing happen, so don't worry about it, Keith.
I also have a dachshund who might appear in frame. Just be warned, but he's a good deal smaller than Keith. Yeah, I'm still in the process of kind of thinking about what environmental history can do for us, and it's teaching me small things that change um, how I think about colonial history. So like a very my MA project, I worked on colonial Florida, and I met an archaeologist there who said that the most common botanical trace that they find in Spanish mission sites is peach pits. Well, peaches don't grow in Florida, or at least not like special cultivars designed to deal with the heat. And the Spanish are always complaining about how cold it is, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, except when you consider that it was colder there and they lived in St. Augustine, which is a very humid place. That like I don't know if you've ever been in Florida when it's cold, especially near the ocean, but it's like a very bone chilling cold. And so Florida was viewed as like a punishment kind of assignment for many soldiers, especially like from Havana. And you can start to understand that. And then I think also with my current research, um, thinking about, we know that Indigenous people on the East Coast and really most of the Americas had extensive fire regimes. Um, and in my area, there's these, well, they're high altitude for the East Coast. They're about a mile high. They're called balds, and they're these high altitude grassland ecosystems. And only in recent decades have we started to figure out that they have to be maintained through some way. And the way they choose to do that here is through wild ponies instead of indigenous fire regimes. But it makes you realize how people are connected to the landscape, and also how landscape is kind of guiding the, how it shapes indigenous lifestyles, and also how it's guiding colonialism to sort of landscapes that they can respect or understand or enjoy, which apparently did not include Florida.
So thank you for those comments. That's very interesting. The playing detective, as I was accusing you three of doing a few minutes ago, you three are my sources currently for environmental history. And I'm detecting in your conversations that it's a relatively new field. And by that I say it doesn't have a series of sharply divided subdivisions, and you're an expert in the 1860s Irish, whatever. Keith, you spoke about, wandering all over the place geographically for your work, and Melissa's done the same, and so has Scott, geographically and through time. My own discipline is statistics, and it really did get started literally formally about 100 years ago. Ronald Fisher was doing work in England and others. And I'd say by the 1950s, it had matured to a discipline where it was being used actively and appreciated by scientists. But at that point, in the 1950s, a statistician knew everything about everything, right? If you're a statistician, whatever the current state of knowledge was, you knew something about almost all of it. And we've moved beyond that now. But it sounds like environmental historians probably know a lot about a lot of environmental history because it hasn't been a discipline in action for like 150 years or something like that. When did it start? When do you think environmental history first started to become its own thing? Is there a sharp demarcation for that? Keith looked like he had a big grin on his face. I'll see what he's got to say.
I was going to say, I wonder, Melissa, when you organize your class on this, when do you start? I mean, it's so funny because there's some ways in which you can say, all right, let's begin our story in the 1980s. And we can start with Carolyn Merchant and William Cronin and Don Worcester and say, okay, we've got these three, and that's how we want to tell our story. But then you start to look, you're like, okay, well, there are people sort of writing about nature in the past, even earlier than that. So I think environmental history as a field, yeah, we're going to say like, okay, the 1980s is really when it sort of gets formalized. And there is still a moment now, I think, the idea that you can know a lot about a lot really is a good comment. It's one of the best things about the field is that we can pick up books and say, oh, you know, it's important for me to know a little bit about East Asia and a little bit about the Ottoman Empire, and you know, to really move around through recent books in the field. But yeah, I would say the 80s, but I don't know, where would the rest of you put it?
Scott, since I skipped over you.
Sorry, my mouse was not being cooperative. I mean, I was trying to think about, so in some ways environmental history is a very modern field, but then like the books that I consider environmental history that I read for my comprehensive exams were William Cronin, Changes in the Land, and Alfred Crosby's The Columbian Exchange, which are both books about the early modern period. Now, I know that most of the rest of the field has been more modern focused, including like Cronin's work on Chicago and other things like that. But I think actually that environmental history does have some roots in the early modern period. I was also thinking in the 1940s and 1950s, the Annalists of Europe, specifically a guy named Fernand Braudel, are writing intensely about landscape and people's relationship to landscape in the context of the 16th century. So it's not that there's not a history of historiography of environmental history for the early modern period. It's just that it had a promising start, and then I think it took a little break.
And then you guys came along and revived it. Melissa, when would you say it started? And
No.
it didn't start. It didn't start in January when you started your environmental history class. So it's got to be before that, right?
I taught it the year before, so yeah, I guess.
Oh, okay. So
No,
a year ago.
Yeah, I was also thinking of Braudel and the Annalists, and if you study history for any length of time, you know, you encounter Braudel, right? Who like writes things like, yeah, like people who live in mountains are like this because they're, you know, like they're built this way because they're born on a mountain, which is kind of maybe backwards, but you know, backwards relationship. Yeah, so I think in as Scott was pointing out, yeah, some of the kind of really early works do actually deal with this period, but yeah, I think like a promising start, and then maybe a bit of more of a rush to get to more modern topics. And I think it's also true that you know, environmental history as a self-defined field is maybe a more recent construct, but writing about the environment and thinking about people's relationship to the environment does have a longer genealogy. It's just that people weren't you know, it was a, you know, scholars might be writing about that alongside other concerns, or as a, you know, as a supplement to other kinds of works, and they weren't saying like, I am an environmental historian. And I guess perhaps even defining yourself that way as a subfield is kind of relatively new also, in some regards.
Interesting. So what would a historical environmentalist look like?
I mean, this is one of the most fun questions, I think. I have an argument in the book. I'll be curious if people actually agree with it or not. I mean, I think it's right since I wrote it, but I don't know if anyone else will, which is that there is a consciousness that feels recognizable to us in the early modern period, in which people praise landscapes for their aesthetic qualities, that they celebrate different species as valuable, and yet it coexists with so much nasty stuff. So in the case, I'm thinking of one particular individual, Richard Lagan, who wrote A History of Barbados, and he has these huge long musings about the forest and how much he loves the various trees he encounters, and he writes about all of their different uses. And he'll write about physical beauty. He writes about how comfortable he is just sort of wandering in the woods by himself, which is very atypical for early modern English people, and certainly with what we would think of as a sort of a colonial mindset. There's something there that feels environmental. At the same time, right after those passages, he's like, of course, it's all got to fall down for sugar, which is the way that we're going to make a ton of money. And so I think the thing that is really useful about early modern work is that you see these things that feel recognizable and then something that does not feel recognizable all at the exact same moment. And I think but in seeing that, it can really challenge us as we think about environmentalism at the present. I mean, Lagan tolerated atrocities, right? Tolerates slavery. He's going to give a justification for it later in it. But he's quite concerned with trees. And, we want to distance ourselves from the ugliness of that past. But I think in some recent moves in the environmental movement, you've seen them trying to reckon with that movement's sort of darker 20th century and 19th century history. And I think as you pull back, you can see a lot of those tensions have deeper roots as well.
There are questions popping up in the Q&A and chat. So if you guys spot something that looks like something you want to jump in on, feel welcome to do that. Sean was posed as part of a question, but made the point that I'm sure people are doing this when they're thinking of restoring a landscape to its former self. For example, in the Carolinas, if you restored it to a grassland, that might not be such a great idea at this current moment with global warming. Trees might be a better stopping point, but that's not an environmental history question per se, but it's certainly a comment on, well, to a certain extent it is, because the climate we're dealing with now is a consequence of our history and our relationship with, or lack of relationship with, the environment. Restoring it to when, taking into account current sensibilities and current needs, current demands on ourselves. We always have this tension between enjoying it, aspects of it for its own sake, at the same time reaping the financial benefits. And I think over, at least in the past couple hundred years in North America in particular, the economic benefits have usually won the day, which is, well, that's history, and it's our history. It's part of our part of who we are now. Looking at a specific question that somebody put in about an introduction of a particular grass, Kentucky bluegrass, apparently introduced by the Spanish. What did that do? Any of you three have any idea on what impact that might have had on the indigenous environment? If somebody's got an answer or wants to jump in with some speculation or thought, I'd be glad to hear that.
I don't know, but Lyle's in my class, so you should write a paper about that. No, I'm just
right, and present it in your lab.
It's a great question. I mean, I don't know about that. I'm not sure. I haven't read anything about that, but I don't know if other people.
Well, so I think one of the interesting things about Lyle's question that I think is really cool. So there are plans in early modern Europe from some of the big improvers that, I know Melissa would have worked with a lot. Samuel Hartley, he has this plan to burn out grass in every pasture in England and replace it with a Dutch grass that he believes is superior to the English grass. And this does happen. Ryegrass takes over in pastures in Ireland and England, more so as an 18th, 19th century phenomenon as you get more intensive pastoral economies there. You could try to trace that out historically. The Spanish record Scott would know a lot more about than me, but as you get later in history and as you start to move towards the United States, I think you could maybe find, are people doing these introductions? Are they commenting on grass or agricultural improvers saying things about that? And so while I don't know about this specific grass species, you would be shocked how much commentary you can find on grasses if you start to look in, I think, the weird little back corners of archives, but also things like agricultural magazines, newspapers, things like that. It is a great project. I totally agree with Melissa. You should write on it.
Boy, I bet he's regretting that question now.
No pressure. And also, I mean, to your point, I haven't talked as much about this as a source, but I use a lot of botanical works and things like this, and they will sometimes have pressed plants in them. Or I found people, writing letters about plants, and they'll include a specimen. And I myself haven't done much of this. I just like to take pictures and see where they are sending these things. But there are people who can do the work to say, like, this is this specific kind of species or subspecies, and sort of from a different angle doing the kind of thing that Scott is talking about, verifying that this certain thing, this certain plant did have a different geographic range, right? And so there's some really interesting stuff that I think like lots of work that remains to be done, right? That could add to what we know about these past environments.
The Spanish sources, to speak to those specifically, they look at the landscape with the eye of an Italian nonna. They're looking for wheat and olives, and to introduce those things that are like part of the Mediterranean suite of plants and animals. And so when you release wild hogs into the Southeast, for example, and they take off, now wild hogs are annoying animals that we find very destructive, but the Spanish kind of see like, oh, it's a land of jamon waiting to be made. But what they don't have that kind of fine botanical sense in the 16th century. They're just like, this land is good, there's lots of pigs. Or, this land is agreeable because there's lots of chestnuts. And really because the sort of financial model of exploration is a bunch of guys raise some money and rent a boat and go try to find themselves a new Peru or Mexico. Really what they're most interested in is mineral wealth. It's actually why we know so much about these pearls that they're finding in the Southeast, because with the exception of some gold deposits in North Georgia, there's not much obvious mineral wealth in the Southeast. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Spanish presence there never really, it was always kind of tenuous and half-hearted.
Interesting.
But to add one thing that I do think is interesting is Nahuatl speakers, the people we would call Aztecs, do have a kind of botanical sense. And so one of the other documents I'm working on is a guy from the Southern Great Plains who's brought to Mexico City. And the Aztec people there, they're from, I can't remember what neighborhood in Mexico City, but they go through a plant list that's very similar to a plant list in the Florentine Codex, which is kind of an Aztec encyclopedia from a few generations before. And they're like, do you have chamomile? Do you have like various medicinal and useful herbs from the sort of Aztec universe? So through Mexico, we can start to see a kind of more species-specific vision of the world, but the Spaniards aren't skilled naturalists at the time.
There's the work you three do and others like you, the other four people in your discipline. No, I'm joking. There's more than that, I'm sure. Digging into historical archives and of various sorts to try and tease out the environmental story. Flipping that around, a couple of questions have come up in the Q&A and chat about the impact of environmentally stout moments like volcanic eruptions, of course, affecting history for the next decades or maybe even longer than that. If any of you want to make a comment, it's not directly in the work you do, but I suspect it's something that perhaps all three of you might have something interesting to say. Whoever wants to go first, go.
I mean, I can talk about sort of my field in general. There's a lot of work, well, there's a lot of emerging work on volcanoes in Central America because they were a central aspect of colonial life, especially because Mexico City, you have Popocatépetl, which is this great snow-covered mountain that you can see from anywhere in Mexico City, assuming the smog is acceptable that day. But it erupts pretty regularly, especially on Puebla, which is a sort of secondary city just outside of Mexico City. And so those two cities have strong ties, both religiously and ecologically, to volcanoes. Santiago, Guatemala, or not Santiago, the capital of Guatemala, whose name eludes me at this very second, also has Antigua, Guatemala is right next to volcano. And Antigua was the on and off capital of Spanish Guatemala. Another thing in Mexican history is what we call the desagüe. So Mexico City used to be like Venice on this brackish lagoon. And between 1521 and about 1950, that lake was slowly shrunk. And so it changes the way that people relate to the land, but also it's the reason why Mexico City is slowly falling into the earth, because the water that held up that aquifer is being removed. So the environment's a very important consideration in Mexican and Guatemalan history, but that's sort of the major focus of environmental history in Latin America.
And
Melissa, Keith?
Yeah, I was gonna say, so there's a larger, it's interesting. Volcanoes are great because, of course, you know, Scott pointed out, they're parts of local environments that can have really dramatic impacts on those living around them, whether they are dead, dormant, or very much alive. But
that's the volcanoes, not the people, right?
Yes. But there's also a way in which volcanoes are a global force. So some of what we know from the work of paleoclimatologists who've been working on, and this comes up really importantly for what for Europe we call the early medieval period or late antiquity, but also for the early modern period, a number of volcanic events shot so much ash into the sky. And in particular, things like sulfur compound, sulfur dioxide, that act essentially as blockers of solar radiation and can meaningfully alter the climate. So I see Jackson in the chat mention the 1815 volcanic eruption, and Frankenstein. Yeah, there's multiple years called years without a summer, and a number of those are bound up with volcanic eruptions. So there's a way in which it can be crucial for local history, but it can also become these global events when we start thinking about climate.
And just to speak to that 1815, there's actually a really good book on the Tambora eruption, and it's called like Tambora, I think, or has some, you know, fun subtitle. So there is a book on that, that specific one that Jackson was asking about. I mean, also to address some of the, if I may, some of the other questions that have come up.
Of course.
Including several near and dear to my heart. So, you know, Maggie talked about braiding sweetgrass and the search for and knowledge about natural medicine as a part of ecological history. So, I mean, I haven't talked so much about this, but a lot of my work is about people. You know, for me, I see the, you know, quote unquote voyages of discovery, right? Like these European early, Voyages, like, they're looking for spices, right? Like, that's like what kind of like gets this whole thing kickstarted, right? Which are plants. Like, so it's all about looking for plants. Now, okay, the Spanish wind up finding gold and silver and some other things that becomes a bit of a distraction. But the whole time, they're also, the Spanish and those in Portuguese and everyone else who comes after, the other Europeans that come after them, are always looking for essentially plant products, right? If they find a mine, that's great too. But they're always assessing the environment. And a lot of, I mean, to speak to this question about medicine generally, a lot of plants are assessed as medicine, right? Even things that we don't think of as medicine, in my case, tobacco, but I mean, anything, right? Is almost everything is like, what does this do? Can it cure anything? How do people use it? And while there is oftentimes, suspicion perhaps about indigenous informants who maybe use these as part of, religious ceremonies or things like that, there is still a willingness, particularly among people who are living in the Americas, to accept that, indigenous and also African medicinal knowledge when they're pretty sick and they need it, right? And that does filter over to Europe. Some some things take longer than others, but there is an interest in those questions about natural medicines and how they're
Scott, were you about to say something, or Keith?
Some kind of feedback noise where I can't hear Melissa.
Yeah, I'll turn my microphone off for a sec, see if that helps.
That seemed to be it. Yeah. I love braiding sweetgrass. I just finished it pretty recently. One thing I know from studying Florida is some of the first Jesuits to come to the East Coast. They established very brief-lived missions in the Chesapeake Bay area, in Miami, and in Tampa. This is in the 1560s. But one of the things that they decide is that for some reason they think that sassafras is a cure for syphilis. And so one of the ways that they're going to support themselves in the New World, besides relying on indigenous people, is the sassafras trade. Now, the indigenous people of the Southeast don't take kindly to the Jesuits, and they leave after about 2 years or are massacred, depending on the location. But they've had really high hopes for wood that smells like root beer.
Sassafras is the thing for the English too. I mean, later on, they're like, oh yes, this is going to be great. We're totally going to do something with this. I also love braiding sweetgrass. I wrote an essay with a painter friend of mine at ISU where we went through pieces in the herbarium where John Wesley Powell actually contributed quite a few, speaking of the American West. And we tried to think about how Robin Wall Kimmerer's work, both gathering moss and braiding sweetgrass, can help us to rethink some of the artifacts we have of European collecting practices and what gets gathered, how we can start to reappraise these objects. Because what's great about Kimmerer, I think, is that she's sort of challenging us to rethink what medicine those things can be. And of course, as Melissa encounters, as I encounter, as Scott encounters, when Europeans are hunting for medicine, they're hunting for it as a commodity that's going to benefit the Atlantic trade. They are imagining ways that they can turn this to their benefit. And I think the more reciprocal relationships that, say, like Kimmerer is imagining are not one that they're hitting. I wanted to grab another question just for a second, if we could, from the Q&A. Melissa Johnson had a really, I think, a great and interesting one. And thank you for coming, Melissa. It's really nice to see your name. On memory, and I'll just read it so I get it right. She asks that so many of our sources are rooted in memory, faulty or otherwise, and if there's any work on memory and the environment in this period. I think about some people in literary studies who hit on that pretty well. One of the interesting people, Andy Wood, wrote a book, The Memory of the People, on the English landscape and the way in which memory is inscribed in the landscape. And that's one that I've tended to think about a lot, because for a number of the places we encounter, colonialism is an act of real disruption of memory, and people are quite upset about it. But even in England, as there's internal sort of shifts, improvement, things like that, in Ireland, as there's efforts to kind of create new types of property ownership and things of that nature, there's efforts to sort of recreate memory. There's a geographer, William Smith, who's written on maps and memory in early modern Ireland, and I'd say his book's excellent on that as well. But I think there's so much space available for how people are actually trying to say, what did past land look like? What was weather in the past? Things like that. And we've only just begun to scratch the surface. I don't know what the rest of you think on that.
Yeah, those are some good recommendations. I was struggling to come up with something, and I think that question is a great question. The one book I was thinking of too, I don't know, and I'm partly thinking of it because this is what we're reading next week in my class, but Dolly Jorgensen's Recovering Species in the Law, Recovering Lost Species in the Modern Age. But it's interesting because and it touches upon these questions we've been talking about too, like what version of that environment do you repopulate? And part of what she talks about is how, efforts to recover lost species is also about our own emotions and, memory, but also like our feeling. It's about our feelings in some ways, like, right. Like we like this like cute little fluffy animal that used to exist here, this like little flower. And so that is more, more about our own time, but it's another work I would recommend for people interested in that in any age, as it seems like from the questions, lots of you are. So
I really appreciate the questions that are coming in and the conversation that the three of you are having, engaging with each other and with the questions. Formally speaking, this event is scheduled for an hour from 5:30 Mountain Time to 6:30, and inevitably there's energy, and I love it that it's going to go on past it, but I don't want to, especially since Scott is only minutes away from having to run off to become a dad, possibly. I don't want to impose on your time. So if at this moment, it's 6:45 my time, Melissa's time, if you want to take a few minutes to maybe wrap up or take a look into the chat and the Q&A and answer one more question or something, I think it's time to sort of shift in towards closure. It's been a wonderful conversation though. So I'll let you three navigate that.
I mean, just quickly, I saw Michael's question about agricultural history, and is it more about economics or is it about environment? And I mean, I would say the answer is yes. I mean, for me, like working on tobacco, a lot of the older stuff like is more about the economics of it, some about the environment, but like I'm interested in like how do people learn how to grow this thing, and how do they learn like what the right type of soil is, and how do they get that knowledge from indigenous people, and how do Africans learn this too. So I think that I think that those are so tightly connected, right? Always. So even an economic history about agriculture is inevitably also about the environment, right? Like there was a bad year this year. Well, why? It was an environmental reason, right? So, but I'll let the two of you address any other questions you.
I was going to say, that's the perfect answer. And my answer was also yes. But I think that points to a bigger one, because there was another question in the Q&A from Sean asking if our focus is on environmental use and how environment is changing in response to it. I think in part it's always got to be both. And at least for me, the goal is always to do both, to understand the decisions past people made and the impacts it had on physical landscapes, but also the motivations and things for that. And I think, I'm an evangelist for environmental history, but environment is everywhere. And I think that whether you're thinking about the early modern past, when, as Melissa's pointed out, a lot more people are living very close to the land and are aware of their dependence on it. But even in the present, there's a number of ways that if we conceptualize environment broadly, we can really rethink the world around us. We can start to ask questions about our relationship with other people. We can ask our questions about our relationship with animals that are not human. We can get into our relationships with plants in various ways. But it really is everywhere. And I hope that those of you who are listening, who are historians, who are thinking about teaching history, things like that, will embrace just how all-encompassing environmental history can be, and will think of yourselves at least some ways as environmental historians.
Gotta unmute myself. I mean, I would also encourage people to go into environmental history. I mean, I think, like I said at the beginning, I fell into it by accident, and that's because if you develop an ear for it, if you start to think of it, it is everywhere. And so I was thinking about the question about farming and also the question about the introduction of new species. And so I want to tell a little story from colonial Cuba and Hispaniola that I think can make us think about the relationship between new species, old species, and the way people make their living. When the Spanish got to the Caribbean, they introduced cattle and pigs and horses, and they were wildly successful because there weren't any large predators on those islands. There's really no large mammals in the Caribbean, but the indigenous people raised root vegetables. They raised manioc or cassava or yucca, depending on where you're from, and they raised sweet potatoes. Well, the pigs got out and would get into these hill mounds where they would raise all their food. And so the Taino are enslaved by the Spanish to work in gold mines because there's not laws against it yet. Their agriculture is being undercut, and the pigs are sort of pushing them over the brink. And so people, landscape, economy are all kind of the same story, in a way that I think we would do better to think more about.
It's all interconnected. It's all interconnected. Well, I'm going to thank all three of you for joining us for this conversation tonight. It's one that we probably could easily continue on for another hour or two, but it's been a wonderful hour and change listening to you. So I'll ask Scott to step in and formally stop the recording. Scott Henkel, that is, Scott Cave.